This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're listening to Agriculture Today. Welcome once again. This week's cattle market commentary provided to us by the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center in Denver. Of course, that's a project co-sponsored by K-State and other land-grant universities. Jim Robb with us once more. We have several things, Jim, we'd like to get into this week, but to start with, just a quick look back at the trade this past week. There was some weakness that settled in the fed cattle sector.
A little bit of weakness in the fed cattle sector, although in the prior 2 weeks or so, we were probably a little bit stronger than anticipated. I think the market is stepping back a little bit, waiting to see, in terms of purchasing cattle, and waiting to see how the meat movement is as we get into our first big summer grilling season weekend of the year, and to see how this weather shakes out for weekend grilling prior to that. So
nothing to be really alarmed about when we see the market take a couple of steps back like it did last week? Not overly alarmed. We would like it to be steady to a little bit higher, but the seasonal weakness that's starting to develop is about on cue. And again, we're into that season where we would expect retail beef demand to be stepping up somewhat anyway. And so that's still in place for the most part? It appears to be. It looks like we've got a lot of good featuring ahead for the 3-day weekend and a good meat movement. And this is filtered back through the marketing system. And so we are moving a lot of cattle into the marketplace, which is probably the major factor dampening cattle prices. And with the discount in the futures, we have a lot of people wanting to sell cattle. So I think it's been more of a supply side on the cattle price softness as opposed to a demand issue. We have several things that are beyond just the normal supply and demand we wanted to pick up on this week, Jim. One of which the USDA has come out with quite a run of information on forage availability, including its first weekly pasture and range conditions report. What did that have to say? Well, the USDA starts those essentially on May 1, so they put those out and we'll be consistently getting those every week. And it largely, as we anticipated, even though it's early in the grazing season, we've had some areas in the northern parts of the U.S. that probably a little bit late on turnout, and we've obviously had the very dry conditions in droughty areas of the southern plains. So those conditions really did show up in terms of the pasture and range situation. We're really not using much subsoil moisture yet, so this is a bit of a precarious situation. I think that report indicated so. So what does that portend in as far as the normal movement of cattle through the marketing channels here in the months ahead? Well, I think we'll continue to see cows that are not pregnant or that have lost their calves at this point in time moving to market very quickly, keeping some pressure on this cull cow market. I think on the rest of the animals, it's a bit of a wait and see. A lot of these calves are still very lightweight and on the ground. Much too early for early weaning programs, et cetera, to set in. Dovetailing with this, though, we've had a lot of forage that's needed to be used so far this year, and we continue to feed forage in some areas of the U.S. when we should be heading out to grass. So, the forage marketplace is probably reflecting that, too. And that takes us right into a companion report on hay stocks as of May the 1st, and those are tighter than expected as well, you say. We expected, nearly record-tight nationwide hay stocks as of May 1 reported by USDA, and they actually came in tighter than we anticipated. We look at the northern plains of the U.S., we fed a lot of hay. We look at the southern plains of the U.S. because of very dry conditions. We fed a lot of hay. In fact, we fed more than normal. And so the decline in hay stocks we get 2 reports a year, December 1 and May 1. May 1 kind of starts our new crop year. That overwinter usage, even though we didn't have, a severe winter year, except for in northern Montana, et cetera, we fed more hay than normal, as I mentioned earlier. So these hay stocks are very tight, and we've seen that in hay prices, where hay prices have been consistently moving higher year over year. And, some of our other feedstuffs, corn is up, et cetera, but the hay market has been, surprisingly strong, and it is really that stock situation. Then we move into the new crop year. Nationwide, we're going to have fewer hay acres harvested. We have less in the west of alfalfa acres planted. And then Mother Nature will have a lot to say, as you know, Eric, about our upland hays, et cetera, that can be harvested in the high plains in the Midwest. And, so we're in a season where some planning on the hay forage side, given these very tight stocks, especially in the southern plains, where we went into the year with strong stocks in the southern plains. Now we're at a situation of tight stocks.
You do have the state breakdown handy there. If you look at Kansas and adjoining states, is that tightness in hay supplies even more acute?
More acute in the Southern Plains, absolutely, okay. Eric. And that's really something in a management sense that we need to look at and see how this crop develops. It seems like some of the hay is being cut and baled rather quickly here. I expect there'll be a lot of this early cuttings of hay sold directly into the marketplace.
It'll be interesting to see how those forage needs are covered as we move forward and how that affects producers' production decisions likewise. Steer and heifer dressed weights. We're back on the supply side for one moment here, and those are declining on a seasonal basis. What is that telling us, Jim?
Well, they probably declined just a little bit more than seasonally compared to where we started this calendar year, Eric. That shows us that we've continued, not quite as aggressively as last year, but the marketplace is pulling animals through the system. And so this decline in dressed weights, we're essentially down at the prior 5-year average. The long-term trend in dressed weights has been higher and higher and higher for decades. Now we're going to have 2 years in a row where we do not have, it looks like, the normal year-over-year increase. We'll have an increase this year, but it may not be as much as normal. So we're very current in the feedlots. This is important as we head into this time of year, especially as we get closer to June, and we have these larger cattle supplies ahead. So not quite as much pulling through of animals through the marketplace, which is a good thing as last year, but still very aggressive. Packers have been pulling these animals through, and that has kept these dressed weights very much in check and probably more than anticipated.
So this bodes well for this market, in a sense, having good footing going forward here into the summer months.
Improved footing compared to what we expected. We still see lower seasonal prices into the summer months, but the weight profile is a key to how cattle prices will behave on the fed cattle side for the next 2 to 3 months.
One last item from the USDA we wanted to pick up on as well in its latest World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates report. The first livestock forecasts for the calendar year 2019. What do those numbers have to say, Jim?
Well, those numbers were important, but let me step back just a little bit, Eric. And USDA made some significant revisions, lower in terms of beef production for 2018. The second quarter of this year that we're well into, they lowered beef output. Third quarter, compared to their prior projections, and their second quarter was probably large, but they even lowered their summer quarter beef output. I think this, and we don't know what they're doing behind the scenes, but it appears to us that this is very much a reflection of the weight profile. USDA has probably overestimated these cattle weights. I think a lot of us have tended to be higher than they've come in lately, and really reflecting that. And then also a little bit stronger prices than anticipated in recent weeks. So USDA made a significant lowering of 2018 beef production, which I think represents what some other market analysts think, but it was a bit of a surprise. As we look ahead to 2019, they expect kind of building on that lower 2018 base about the same rate of growth that most of us anticipated. So there's larger supplies of beef ahead. I think all of us agree on that. There's still a larger calf crop here in 2018 versus 2017. We're still cyclically building the size of the calf crops. But the weight profile, I think, is behind some of this adjustment by USDA, especially for 2018.
So as you would read that and those projected numbers, what does that say in general about cattle prices for 19?
Well, cattle prices for 19, this is the supply side only. If we kind of hold demand constant, we would say that we have larger supplies. Exports are growing better than anticipated year over year. We have a little bit of a penchant for lower cattle prices in 2019. But the demand side will be the driver. And the demand side, if we don't have international trade issues, looks very positive. So we could have slightly lower fed cattle prices in 2019, but I would say at this point in time we have some likelihood, maybe not great yet, of a calf market that is year-to-year stronger. So, we are turning the point of building beef supplies dramatically year over year, and in 2019 we continue that moderation pattern, and then we're all going to be looking at demand, domestic and foreign, to be the major price driver in 2019 again.
Well, pulling it back closer to the more immediate, as you look at the trading week ahead, what are your thoughts on the possible direction?
Well, the direction, we're in a bit of that doldrums time frame, waiting to see what happens for Memorial Day in terms of beef movement, et cetera. And so we're probably marking time. A little bit of weakness, again, wouldn't be surprising. But it looks like we have a market that's, going into the second half of May is probably $2 to $4 a hundredweight higher than we thought it would be. So we're holding this market together rather well.
Well, we'd remind folks that you and your team there at the LMIC keep track of these matters and post comments on the market trends online at lmic.info. Great informational source there, so have a look at lmic.info. Jim, as always, thanks for your comments and your insight. We'll talk again later on.
Been my pleasure, Eric.
He's the director of the Livestock Marketing Information Center out of Denver. That's Jim Robb with this week's observations on the cattle market factors here on Agriculture Today. For 25 years, K-State Research and Extension's Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services has been providing a no-cost, confidential place to call in and visit with an agricultural lawyer. Our experts are available to help you producers handle legal and financial issues. Explore your options and generate solutions. Call us at 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services. This Agriculture Today continues now with more on bovine health management for you cattle producers. Once again, Mike Side from the Production Animal Field Investigations Unit of the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at K-State. He's that unit's director, Gregg Hanzlicek. And our topic this time around, Greg, is very timely. That would be fly control for the cattle herd out on grass. Research, you say, has illustrated to us multiple times that this is about economics as well as anything else.
It is, and you're right. We talk a lot about it, and there's been some research that suggests that flies cost the cow-calf industry over $1 billion a year. It's a substantial negative impact on reduced weight gain, decreased grazing efficiencies. We do know that a couple of these flies can actually transmit mastitis in heifers, so it's important we talk about it. It's important that we try to control these external parasites.
One of the most prominent is the horn fly, and we're quite familiar with this one, actually, Greg.
It is, and it's called the horn fly, which I don't really understand because it really doesn't live on the head around the horns. It's the flies producers see on the backs and the sides of cattle, and then in the summer and the heat, they'll move down into the cool side of the belly. But it is a blood feeder. It's been shown that each one of those flies feeds anywhere from 20 to 40 times a day. And so just that irritation alone has a huge negative impact on the production of these cows.
This has been the subject of study, out of the state of Nebraska not too long ago, you say.
Absolutely. A really cool study where they looked at a couple herds, one that controlled corn flies and one that didn't, and they controlled and measured weaning weights, and they found that those herds that did not control horn flies had anywhere from 10 to 20 pound less weaning weights than those that did. So it does have a huge impact on the pounds of beef that producers can sell.
The threshold for controlling horn flies, again, they are in huge numbers on the backs or on the bellies at times of cattle. But how many does one have to observe before they enact some sort of control step?
Well, surprisingly, there is a number out there, and the recommendation is that when you get to about 200 horn flies per animal, that's when you start seeing an economic loss. And one of the recommendations is you really shouldn't start using your insecticides until you get to that point, because your insecticide efficacy is going to decrease through time. And that doesn't mean a producer has to go out there and count the flies. There's pictures on the internet that'll just give you an idea of what the pattern looks like when you get to so many of these flies. For me, that 200 per animal that pattern is really better used later in the fly season when producers are out checking pastures to see how effective their fly control program is as we get midway or 3/4 of the way through the pasture season.
So they can compare their own observations then and make that call whether they're getting anything done.
Absolutely. They can just look for those patterns, and if there's 200 or more, then it probably means we need to enact some other type of control program from this point on.
One of the main defenses against horn flies has been, over time, those insecticidal ear tags, which we'll expand on a little later in our visit. But those are certainly still functional approaches to hornfly control?
They are, and that's probably one of our better controls for hornflies. And the reason our control of hornflies is better than any of the other flies we'll talk about is that they spend their entire life cycle on the cow, except for to leave to lay their eggs in fresh manure. So those insecticide fly tags, any of the other products that actually gravitate across the hairs of the animal are pretty effective against hornflies.
Although you say, by the same token, we do have resistance issues with hornflies here.
We do. It's been shown that we're starting to see some resistance with hornflies to the pyrethroids that we're putting in the insecticide ear tags.
So with that in mind, does one need to think about looking to other means of hornfly control to counter that resistance?
Yes, absolutely. And some of those other things that can be done would be sprays or back rubbers and dusters. Those kind of things, they work well if you can. Dusters and back rubbers work well if you can force the animal to use them. Mm-hmm. Sprays, putting topical sprays on the animals will work well. That's not always practical for large pasture areas. But, yeah, there's a combination of insecticides or programs probably works better than just one.
Now, there is another option out there on the market, the pass-through products.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Because the hornfly lays their eggs in fresh manure, and actually there's some research that says they won't lay them in manure that's more than 2 hours old, but it's fresh. These pass-through products, whether they're an insecticide or insect growth regulator, meaning it's not going to let the larva molt, are very, very effective against hornflies.
Face flies now, and the main worry would be the disease that they can vector.
Absolutely. They are not blood feeders. In fact, the only ones that feed on the animal are the females, and they're the ones that appropriately they're called the face flies. They're on the face, and they're feeding off the eye secretions and the nasal secretions. And when they're feeding, they've got these little rasping mouth parts, and if we get enough of them feeding on eye secretions, then we have an opportunity to irritate the cornea, and that's when we sometimes see pink eye outbreaks is after we have some not effective face fly control.
And you say that those of you at the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory are already receiving cases on pink eye.
Yeah, it's pretty strange that we've already had a couple of what we'd call major outbreaks of pink eye in beef cattle on pasture this year already. It's usually a late summer, early fall thing, but we're seeing it. And over the last couple of years, we've been isolating an organism that we haven't ever associated with pink eye before, and it's called Mycoplasma bovaculi. And this organism is not in any of our pink eye vaccines. The control and the treatment's a little bit different than the other organisms that are commonly associated with pink eye. So if producers have a pink eye outbreak, it's important that they call their veterinarian and ask them for advice. And it might take some diagnostics to try to figure out what organism is exactly causing the issue.
That's the last thing we really need in the industry is another catalyst for pink eye. So good advice about talking to one's practitioner. As far as controlling face flies and trying as best one can to prevent them vectoring pink eye, what can one do?
Well, again, it's the ear tag, and it makes sense. The ear tags are close to the face, and we relatively good control. But the problem is the face flies, they come, they feed, they leave, so they're not exposed to the insecticide, regardless of what type it is, for very long. And so our control for face flies compared to horn flies is not all that good. But insecticide ear tags are probably the way to go.
Well, the last two of the four we'll talk of today, you say they're both extremely difficult to control. Horseflies, everybody recognizes them. They, too, can carry viruses.
Absolutely. Horseflies are blood feeders, and we know that they're associated with both transmitting anaplasmosis and bovine leukosis virus. And like you said, the problem is because where they feed and how quickly they take a meal and then they leave, our control of them isn't as good as it is for hornflies either, because they're just not exposed to very high levels of insecticides.
So what would be the practical approach to dealing with horseflies then?
Well, it's still the same, everything else we do for horn and face, just realizing that pass-throughs are not going to work for horseflies because they don't lay their eggs in manure. So the insecticide ear tags, the pour-ons, the sprays, dusters, they'll all help, but it's just not going to be as effective as we have with horn flies.
And is the same true of stable flies, which are quite the irritant to cattle?
Yes. So when you see cattle bunched up in corners in the pasture, one of the reasons they do that is because these stable flies, they feed on the lower parts of the leg. Again, they're blood feeders, so they're piercing the skin, they're irritating. Because they're on the lower parts of the legs, the insecticides or the treatments that we have, preventative treatments, really are not that effective. So for stable flies, spraying the legs, which is not all that practical, is probably the only real good way to go.
What it comes back to, and you've said it actually a couple of times, Gregg, the primary defense remains those insecticidal ear tags. But even then, there are questions about their durability throughout a season, and you want producers to be mindful of that.
Absolutely. Most of these insecticide ear tags, in fact, all of them their effectiveness will decrease through the pasture season because the insecticide's going away every day. And so, number one, it's important if we use insecticide ear tags, which we highly recommend producers do, is that they remove them at the end of the season, because by the end of the season there is such a small amount of insecticide left that the only organisms or the only flies we're killing are those that are the most susceptible to the insecticide, leaving those that are resistant to breed. The second thing about insecticide ear tags is that we are starting to see horn fly resistance to the pyrethrin ear tags. Mm-hmm. And so to prevent more resistance in herds, it's important that we rotate not the tag name or anything, but the actual active ingredient. So one of the recommendations is to use pyrethrins year 1, year 2, and then year 3 change to organophosphate ear tag, and just keep doing that 3-year rotation. There is a relatively new ingredient on the market it's an avermectin, so it's like the Ivermex, and the recommendation there is to use a pyrethroid the first year and organophosphate the second year, and then go to this relatively new product the third year, and just keep doing that rotation to prevent us killing all the susceptible flies and letting those resistant ones breed.
It is an annual battle that you producers who have cattle out on grass contend with, and that is suppressing fly activity around your animals. Gregg, we appreciate this overview. Thank you.
Thank you.
He's Gregg Hanzlicek, over from the Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory here at Kansas State University. He's with us frequently to look at various aspects of bovine health management here on Agriculture Today.
Did you eat today? Thank a farmer. A way to get more involved in agriculture is through 4-H and FFA. Through 4-H and FFA, we have been given multiple opportunities to grow as leaders and learn more about agriculture.
You can learn skills related to jobs, public speaking skills, and you get the opportunity to travel around the country and meet new people.
If you want more information about getting more involved in 4-H and FFA, visit them on their websites at kansasffa.org and kansas4h.org.
This is Agriculture Today. I'm Jeff Wickman. The 48 Hours of 4-H campaign allows members, friends, clubs, adult volunteers, and 4-H alums to give back to their communities by identifying service projects, then tackling those projects in mid-October. Southeast Area 4-H specialist Beth Hinshaw says this campaign has resulted in some amazing service projects benefiting numerous communities all across Kansas. Beth, one of the pillars of 4-H is giving back to the community, and 48 Hours of 4-H really gives the clubs and people associated with 4-H the opportunity to do that.
Yes, it really does. The 48 Hours of 4-H program is actually a service challenge where the Kansas Youth Leadership Council is challenging all the clubs and groups and counties and districts across the state of Kansas to get involved in some kind of service sometime during that weekend so we can see how much we can do all together across Kansas.
This comes the weekend after National 4-H Week, so it's in October.
Yes, the dates are October 13th and 14th, and you're right, it comes right at the end of National 4-H Week. And one thing that people sometimes get confused about, they think we have to do a service project both the 13th and the 14th for 48 hours. And it's not that at all. It's sometime during that 48 hours we'd love for you to do a service project. It might take 1 hour, it might take 2 hours, it may take a few more hours, but just some time during that 48-hour time frame. And then we also have an option where, if your community has something going on that weekend and you need to do it a different time in October, that's fine too. But we really do like the idea of everybody working on something at the same time.
Well, and the reason we're talking about this now is because now is a great time to start planning.
Yes, things are always better when you plan ahead. And so thinking about the summer ahead of us, we have a little more time maybe to slow down, look around our community, talk to people in our community about what some of the needs are. It also gives us an opportunity to find some partners maybe for a program. Maybe you're going to do something with other youth-serving organizations in town, or maybe you'd like to work with your local service clubs. But all of those things can start to happen, in the summer when we've got a little time and can make some plans and talk to people and think about it.
What are some of the things that people have done in the past? I know this is going to vary from community to community, but what are some things that have been done?
We have had some just amazing projects, and I just love reading through the list every year because they are so varied. But we've had clubs that have sewn pillowcases for the children's department at a hospital. We've had clubs that have gone into a nursing home and played bingo or other games with the residents. We've had other groups who've painted equipment in their park. We've had lots of really wonderful collections for things, shoe boxes of gifts, food, non-perishable foods. There was a club last year that collected all kinds of things for a Laundry Love project. We also have lots of groups that collect things for their local animal shelters. And then we also, it seems like, have lots of great work that happens in parks with cleanup, planting trees. It's right there in the fall, so there's all that fall stuff to do. And they've also done that not just at parks, but in other public places in towns, or even for some of their more elderly neighbors who could use a little help.
It's really kind of gathering those ideas and then narrowing down what the clubs want to do.
Exactly. And when you hear that variety of projects, and that was just honestly just the tip of the iceberg, you can find a project that everybody can be involved in, all the way down to your 5- and 6-year-old clover buds, all the way up to your grandparents who are supportive of your 4-H program.
Well, then one of the things that you would like them to do is get those projects kind of in mind and make sure that they register what they're going to be doing?
Yes. We have a website. It's kansas4h.org/484H. And we'll actually have a guide up there to kind of guide people through what the calendar looks like for 48 hours of 4-H. And we do want everybody to register their project and what they're going to do and where they're going to do it. We have media outlets that call us at times and say, hey, what's happening in such and such county or such and such district. And then once that work is complete, we also ask everybody to go back in and do a follow-up for us with a couple of pictures. And, again, that's just so that we can report out there all the great work that Kansas 4-H is doing. And if people are watching our 4-H Facebook page or our Kansas 4-H Twitter, they get to just see lots of those great images flash across of the different projects that clubs and groups have been involved in.
Well, and that's the other thing you'll want people to do in October is take the time to be active on social media and let people know what you are doing.
Exactly. We want people to know what you're doing in your community and what's happening in Kansas 4-H. As you said earlier, service is really a pillar of the 4-H program, and we love having people see just what our kids can do.
This really involves thousands of 4-Hers helping their communities.
Yeah, it really does. And we do a report every year, and different years. I was just looking back because I believe this will be our 4th year in the project. And we have, different numbers of counties or districts involved every year, and, they raise different amounts of money each year. But looking back, there's usually close to 3,000 and over 3,000 that are involved. We also track how many of those are 4-H alumni. And there's been years that money has been raised for, different causes in communities, as much as $15,000.
The thing that's kind of neat about this is the feeling that I'm sure those who participate in this project get from helping others. It's a great feeling to help others.
Yeah, it really is. And the great thing about that also is, training young people when they're young, how important service is and how serving others makes you feel. Because, these are the same people who are going to grow up someday and, we hope continue to do things to serve their community.
At this point, we want them to save that date of October 13th and 14th and start looking around the community and talking to others about things they might be able to do.
Exactly. Save the date. And as I said earlier, when we plan ahead, we can have an even more impactful or bigger project. So start looking for projects and start looking for partners so that you are ready to go.
That's Southeast Area 4-H Specialist Beth Hinshaw. Again, you can find more information at kansas4h.org. or contact your county or district extension office. For Eric Atkinson, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.